third video. So in this video, we are going to talk about the rest of the speech. So at this point, we've already discussed the overview of the assignment, how it's sort of different than the traditional speech of self-introduction and why it's better this way. And then in the second video, we discussed how to come up with your central idea. So if you haven't watched that part, you should watch that part. So in front of me, I've got the course module. So over here is module 2 that we're looking at. And then this is sort of the list of the different homework assignments that are going to lead you to being able to finish the speech. And then over here, I have the course pack. And you'll see that this module 2 has a whole bunch of different worksheets. Within module 2, in the complete items in module 2 self-introduction, there are a series of videos to look at. One of which is going to be this one once I finish it. So I'm making it right now. And we'll talk about these other videos, how to make an analogy and how to create a narrative. And then there's also some videos on delivery basics. And the assignment description, a little reading, the speech is not an essay that I think is really useful, and also the sample speeches. So that's kind of your getting to know the assignment page. And then if you go back into the module, and there we are, you'll see the sample speeches. You'll see the personality test that we talked about in the last video, and you'll see the links also to these videos for delivery basics. Then what I really want you to focus on here is the submit self-introduction draft, because essentially what this video is going to teach you to do is finish the first draft of the assignment for feedback, and then that draft turns into a revised draft with note cards that's going to create your rehearsal video, and then the feedback that you get on that from the critique is going to create the final video. So you actually submit roughly 3 different versions of this speech to me. You'll probably hopefully write between like 4 and 6 versions of the speech. And I don't mean brand new ideas, but I mean different iterations with different editing and different word choice, things like that. So if we click on Submit Self-Introduction Outline Draft, in the last video I went over how to make the template, how to find the template and create it in the Google Drive folder. But I already have our template. So if we go into the folder where all the templates live, where all the templates live, yes, and also all of the drafts. So we probably will see the templates in capital letters in this drafts folder. Yep, so there are my templates, epidictic template, rebuttal template, and speech of self-intro template. And then we'll see all of the different versions that students have produced and made. And here's my Lee Pierce version hanging out there, so we're gonna go ahead and open that. And again, I created this in the previous video. And in the previous video, using the strategies of invention and all of the different issues that we talked about in the personality test, I created a central idea statement that goes something like, I am a big idea person. I fantasize about future possibilities, but that's frustrating in the present when I'm supposed to be like working on, that's just frustrating in the present. And so now that I've had a chance to like think about that for a day, I don't like this last sentence, but that's, but that means I often don't appreciate what I've got now. There we go. Okay, cool. So, perfect. Great central idea. There's one sort of adjective, which is like a big idea person. And if you don't like all those words, you could say, like, I am a visionary. I like that. That's a nice theme. We talked about the difference between a theme and a central idea. So I'm a visionary. So visionary is like my guiding, and that might even be my title. On being a visionary could be the title of my speech, because we want to title our speech. And I'm going to delete all this. This is the instructions, words, so you can read those later. But I'm going to just go ahead and take all this out. Just because I'm a little bit anal retentive, I like to make things pretty. Okay, nice. All right, so here we have, on being a visionary, got my name. This stuff is kind of just to make sure that I know what I'm looking at. Intercession. Technically, it's Intercession 2020, I think, at this point, but sometimes they call it Intercession 2019. I never know. Nice. So now we have our little template, and it's in the folder right where it's supposed to be, which means when I finish writing this, assuming it's by the due date for drafts, I will be able to get feedback from my instructor on it, which is me. All right. Actually, I lied. That goes here. There we go. Okay. So let's head back over here. So we've done all this. We've created our template. We put it in the thing. And then now we're going to draft the outline for the self-introduction speech. Self-introduction guide with the 16 personalities, already did that. We looked at Nell Casey's Heart of Neatness as sort of a really ideal sample, something we can really aspire to that's really beautifully done, but it has the weaknesses of an essay. So we also want to use our student samples as different kinds of motivation. And then these 3 bullet points, the supports, the criteria for, and we already talked about the criteria for interesting central idea statements. So on this video, we're going to talk about this supports, the analogy, and the narrative. And then we have the pages refer to where they are in the course pack. All right, so let's look at our template. So we already talked about what goes in the template. So we have our central idea, which is the most important piece. So we want to make sure that as we're working on the speech, we're revising this, tweaking it, making sure that it's really saying what we want it to say, because at the end of the day, this is the most important sentence in the whole speech. And so you really want to make sure, you don't need to wordsmith the speech of self-introduction to death. At the end of the day, this template that we're looking at is going to become a set of note cards, and the note cards are going to be very sparse. There's just going to be a few keywords on them, and you're going to use those keywords to recreate whole chunks of the speech. So we don't need to wordsmith to death the speech, since you're not going to memorize it and you won't have the script in front of you. But if there is one sentence that you're going to want to memorize and really wordsmith, it's the central idea, because, oops, sorry, I didn't turn off my notifications. Because this is the sentence that the whole speech kind of boils down to. So this is, if there's one that you're going to memorize, this would be the only one that I would memorize. And so every time I open up my document to revise or add or edit or rehearse, I always try to say my central idea without looking at my notes to see if new words or new language come up, because I always want to be fine-tuning and tweaking that central idea. So I would ignore all this for now. I always write the introduction and the conclusion last. So go ahead and write the central idea that you've come up with, and then we need to come up with 3 supports. So here's the deal. This, another word for supports, it's an acronym that I use. You could also call this evidence. You could also call it elaboration. You could also call it vicarious experience. You could also call it creating audience intrigue. You could also call it adding depth to the central idea, whatever you want to call it. But I will say, here's what normally happens with speeches of self-introduction. People come up with kind of a point of the speech, and then they just keep saying it again and again and again. Here's the deal. You've already said the main claim of the speech, right? I got it. The point that you're putting forward in this assignment is that you're a visionary, and the strength of that is that you are really good at coming up with the big ideas, but you don't necessarily appreciate the present moment. Okay, there is your central idea. I don't want to see that sentence again until restate central idea. Instead, what I want to see is I want to see you develop that. I want to see you amplify it. I want to see you deepen it. I want you to take this sentence that as the audience, I'm a little bit intrigued by. It's a little bit interesting. I'm compelled to listen to the speech. And I want you to continually make it more and more and more interesting. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to pick 2 to 3 supports that go here. And one of them has to be an analogy, and one of them has to be... That's in the assignment description, right? A 2-minute extemporaneous speech through a coherent, specific theme, which we've already got, right? Here's our coherent, specific theme. 2 to 3 pieces of concrete, creative evidence, that's here, including an analogy, a narrative, and 1 other supports. And again, if you do a really good job with your analogy and your narrative, you may not need a 3rd supports. So what are supports? Well, if we come back over here, you'll see that this takes you to supports, quick reference guide. And I will also post a transcript about supports in this video, because I'm going to speak from a set of notes. So for me, because I'm the one that invented this, I can look at a set of notes and I can tell you what all of it means, right? They're my keyword note cards, because I have rehearsed this and I wrote it and I practiced it. But for you, you may want to read about them. So all I need really is this quick reference table, but I'm going to go over each one of these, and then I want you to, I will also post the transcript that explains all of these as well. So supports, S-U-P-P-O-R-T-S. These are the only kinds of evidence that exist anywhere in the world. And I will tell you, and I will go to the grave on this, if you put something in the body of your speech of self-introduction that is not one of these identifiable supports, you are messing up. I've never seen a speech that did something in the body of the speech that didn't already fit into one of these formats. So just do what I'm saying and pick 2 to 3 supports. Now you're required to pick an analogy, which I call, for the sake of fitting it in the supports acronym, I had to call it a parallel. So let's start there. So analogies make an unknown vehicle known by transferring from a known vehicle. So essentially an analogy compares 2 things. One thing is something the audience doesn't already understand, and the other thing is something that you're going to describe. And so in this case, you are the unknown vehicle. So you're going to compare yourself to something else, and you're going to describe that something else so that the audience gets you. Now there's a video, if you go back into the module 2, one of the videos for your assignment is a video about analogies. So I'm not going to repeat how to create an analogy here, all right? Because I've already made a whole video about how to write an analogy. So you can go ahead, here it is. Lee explains analogies. You can go ahead and you can watch that. But let's look at an analogy. So in the previous video, in the Nell Casey Heart of Neatness, we looked at this really interesting narrative analogy over here where she compares what it's like being a neat freak who watches someone enjoy a messy house to what it must be like for someone with an eating disorder to watch someone who can just like guiltlessly devour a meal. That is an analogy, but it's more of a metaphor because it only takes about 2 or 3 sentences. It's incredibly short. It happens much in passing. Analogies are much longer. They're drawn out. And the reason for that is, number one, because it's easier for a speaker to use one really good analogy than it is 6 metaphors. Because for 6 metaphors, you have to remember 6 metaphors. For one analogy, you just have to remember the one analogy. Also, analogies allow the audience to really engage. They're extended, they're longer, they're more detailed, they have concrete specifics. That way, the audience actually has time to participate in the construction of the speech. With something this short and this quick, this metaphor, it comes and goes before the audience has a chance to participate. So you can use a couple of metaphors in your speech, right? Metaphors are really fast. The audience already understands them. They're usually something that circulates in culture. So feel free to throw a metaphor in there if it suits your stylistic purposes. But for the purpose of the evidence, we want a concrete analogy. So let's go ahead and take a look at the analogy from Jeffrey's speech. All right, Sentinel for structure. So if we look at the analogy for Jeffrey's speech, he compares himself to a TV character, which I think is always a great analogy. TV characters are fun. They're usually circulating in pop culture. The audience appreciates your ability to kind of be clever and fun and creative. Plus, I think they're fun for the speaker to kind of compare themselves. You can also do like BuzzFeed quiz, like what sandwich are you? I mean, there's all kinds of ways to come up with the basic metaphor, like what are you going to compare yourself to? And remember that as you're doing the comparison, so as you're comparing yourself to something, there has to be that theme there, right? So whatever character or sandwich or whatever I'm going to compare myself to, the theme has to be this visionary, right? Something that is always looking at the future possibilities, but kind of isn't very present in the moment, right? Because they're always thinking about the next big thing. So you always got to remember that this is the only theme. So whatever analogy, and let's go ahead and say that this is going to be your analogy. You can put them in any order you want. I recommend ordering your supports from weakest, so whichever one is kind of the simplest, to the most complex. That way you're building anticipation and engagement as you go. If you put your like weakest, shortest, most like least interesting supports third, you're kind of losing steam. So I always say order them from weakest to strongest. But for argument's sake, let's put our analogy first. So whatever I compare my analogy, so I am like A, and then I want to come up with what that is because, right, visionary. It has to work that way. So the idea that you're transferring in the analogy has to be the same as the idea from the speech of self-introduction. And then I want to really lay that out. So I'm going to spend 30 seconds, 45 seconds, several sentences really laying that out. So let's see how Jeffrey does that. So the way that Jeffrey does that is he says, here's a fictional character example. The TV show Monk. Monk is this brilliant detective whose success rests solely on his preparedness, the structure of things and attention to detail. Now, those who know Monk knows he suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder. I'd like to think I'm not that far gone. All right, so this is a good start. Couple of problems. One, there's this sentence like those who know Monk. You can't write an analogy assuming that anyone in your audience knows what you're talking about. So you have to act as if everyone in the audience has never heard of Monk. So don't say phrases like, now if you know who Monk is, or for those of you that don't know who Monk is, just talk about it. The other problem is this is the classic principle of show, don't tell. So I'm sure you heard this in high school when you're doing your writing. So if we look over at Nell Casey, there are a few short sentences along the way, right? There's the thesis. There's also this little paragraph right here. And there's also the conclusion. In those moments, Casey tells, right? She's like, this is a telling sentence. These acts do not make me happy. They keep me in a permanent hover around my house, continually preparing to live rather than actually doing it, right? This is a telling. This is just a straight up, here is the point. But you'll notice that happens very rarely. For most of the essay, Casey is showing you what's happened. She's using concrete language, specific details to show you the crumbling house and the crumbling marriage, to show you what it's like when they're tidying their house, to show you what it's like when they're at someone else's house that doesn't have this drive to compulsive. So you really want to show, not tell. There's no showing happening here. There's no depth. It's just like, hey, there's this TV show. The main character is Monk. He's a brilliant detective. Notice that's an adjective. His success is on his preparedness. There's another adjective. The structure and attention to detail. So essentially, all Jeffrey has said here is, I'm like Monk because I like things prepared. So at that point, like, why even do the comparison at all? You haven't added anything at all, except you've just brought Monk in. So this is more of a metaphor. I'm like Monk because we both like to be prepared. We both like structure. It helps us solve problems. Great. Instead, right, find an actual example. Like, what was the problem that Monk, the detective, was trying to solve? What episode was it from? Who murdered who? What was Monk doing? What was it like when he was in the room looking at clues? Where was his preparedness, right? Show me those things, because as I'm watching Monk do all of this craziness in the living room, I can imagine what it's like to be Jeffrey. And that's the fun part of the speech. And then if you want to add with like, now Monk's got obsessive compulsive disorder. I'd like to think I'm not that far gone. That's fine. That's cute. But this is kind of just a little flourish. The functional structure of the analogy has to be much more detailed. So now if we head over to Marissa's speech, right? Because this is the difference between why Jeffrey's speech is more like a B-, C+, and Marissa's is an A-. Let's look at Marissa's analogy. So again, high self-monitor, overthink, but I'm also really good at like focusing on, like I'm intuitive, I connect with people. So that's the theme. So we want to make sure that this remains present throughout the analogy. So analogy, I'm like one of those slightly older but still good iPhone models, like a 5. When the battery gets up to around 10%, that phone really wasn't set up for the connection speed. It's got a small battery, less storage for photos, horrible old charging port before the lightning, phone that dies at like 8%. So this could use a little cleaning up because there's like this battery gets around 10%, then there's this 8%. So she's being a little redundant here. You think you've got time to send that text, but nope, the phone is dead as soon as you try to send it, even though you're only at 8%. It takes forever for the phone to charge again. You got to sit by a wall outlet for 10 minutes, like in the airport, to get enough battery to turn it on. And you want to keep it on while it's charging so you can finish sending the text, but now you're going to be late because you got to sit there and wait for the damn phone to charge because you should have just turned it off in the first place. But you can't, because if you don't keep the phone entirely off, then it won't charge at all. So much like me trying to make friends, trying to use an iPhone 5C is going to require a lot of investment, right? So great. So she's like the cell phone because it doesn't have the bandwidth to do all of the things that you want it to do. She's not like an iPhone 10, which has all this bandwidth, right? And so notice the concrete details. Could it use some work? Yeah, that's why it's an A-. But it's really concrete. You can kind of imagine the scenario. You're laughing because we all remember like what it was like to have those older phones. Maybe your phone died recently and you had to like use a 5 for a couple of weeks. And so we get the sense of what Marissa's like because of this analogy. All right. So, and there are other analogies in the video, but first thing you got to do is you want to construct an analogy. And then the second thing you want to do is you want to construct a story. Right? I call it a narrative because I don't want you to confuse it with like an anecdote. So for the narrative, you want to tell a story that illustrates your central idea. So in my case, I want to tell a story about being a visionary, somebody who's like always thinking about the next best thing, but that means that I sort of like am frustrated in the moment. And again, if we head over to complete the items in module 2, you'll see that I have a little audio recording from my podcast about how to write a really good story. Stories have a plot structure. And also, if you come over into your me go to the table of contents real quick. If you come over into your course pack, you'll see that the transcript of me explaining the narrative is in your course pack. So if, as you're listening to the audio, you want something to read, it's in there. You'll also see that there's a transcript for Lee explaining the analogies. It's like a note-taking guide. So if you want a visual to look at and you want to take some notes, if you want to practice evaluating an analogy, which is normally an activity we'll do in class, but if this is an online class, if you're watching this in a semester that's online, we actually do it in class. So I have some like worksheets and different things for you. And then the other thing I have is I have actual worksheets for your speech. So I have a 3-column analogy chart. So your vehicle would be you, right? So I am like a question mark, right? What am I like? And then what's the idea? So the idea always has to match the theme. So in this case, the idea would be, for me, it'd be visionary. For Marissa, it'd be like overthinker. For Jeffrey, it'd be like obsessed with structure, a structuralist, whatever you want to say. And then when you fill it out, I have instructions. In the left-hand column, you list all the concrete details, right? In the right-hand column lists corresponding characteristics, but you should never actually say them. So if you notice, if we go back over to Marissa only ever talks about the cell phone. Marissa doesn't talk about herself because that's no fun. If Marissa's just going to talk about how she's an overthinker, then what's the point of the analogy, right? The point of the analogy is to describe the cell phone, much like Jeffrey only described Monk. So don't flip-flop between you and the metaphor that you've chosen for the analogy. Just stick with the comparison. And the chart is kind of a way to help you brainstorm and formulate that. All right. So for the narrative, you got to make sure you have a plot structure. And I've made you there's a little worksheet here on page 42 as well. So you can think about like, what's the setting? So maybe my setting is, I was on third date with someone and things were going really well. We were gearing up for our first long night in with dinner and a movie and well, you know, right? ... Can it be funny? I don't know. I'm like making this up as I go. So there's your setting. And then your rising action, which is always the longest part. I finished cooking, I don't know, whatever I would make, roast lamb with potatoes. And I, of course, really wanted the food to be delicious so I could show off my skills. And as I was serving up dinner, my date said, this is good. And then just went along chewing, looking for something on Netflix, right? And I was chewing, and I put my fork down. And notice how I make my sentences really short. I never write more than I can say in a breath. And I talk out loud as I write. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to write down a bunch of information that you then have to struggle to remember when you speak. So I always tell the story out loud, and I write as I speak. Because this is not an essay. Nobody is sending this in for syntax and grammar perfection. You have to write in a way that's comfortable for you. I asked them, don't you think it would be better if it had more salt? They said, yeah, I guess, but it's fine. It's good, really. I said, yeah, it's good, but these potatoes, they would have been better if I had mashed them and made an au jus. And this is really like the kind of stuff that goes through my head. So again, I'm trying to really create what it would be like to be in this situation with me. Ooh, maybe next time I'll cream half Yukon Gold and half parsnip. That'd be awesome. And my partner is like, yeah, okay, but this is good now, so just like, thanks for dinner and don't worry about it. I took a second and another bite. And then I said, oh, you know what we should make next time, before I could finish, my date threw down their fork and was like, could we just finish what we're already eating, please? Right? So there's the story. And it follows the exact structure. There's a little bit of setup, right? Not too much. We don't want to waste time on setup. Then there's a nice long rising action, yada, yada, yada. And you're seeing that as the rising action is happening, you're noticing me with this like visionary thinking. Now it's about cooking and dating. It could be about anything. I could have told another story about me creating a classroom project or another story about planning a high school reunion. I mean, anything you want. The story just needs to be that concrete. You're seeing me fantasize about future possibilities, right? Wanting a better date, wanting the food to be even better, wanting to try new recipes. And then the problem is that in the moment, I'm sort of making this person, I'm giving the impression that like what's happening right now isn't even that important to me. Great. And notice it doesn't take that long. And I wrote it exactly like I tell it. And as I'm practicing it, I might tweak a few things. And I also use the rule of 3. I think the rule of 3 is really helpful for the rising action. So the first time it's like salt, and they're like, yeah, it's fine. And the second time it's like, oh, but what about the potatoes? And like, yeah, it's fine. And then the third time it's like, oh, this, and that. And they're like, okay, you know what? Just knock it off. So I use the rule of 3 to create anticipation. So that's something that we talk about in the other book, in the other video. So when in the audio about narratives, I talk about the Boy Who Cried Wolf, which is also in your course pack. Where is it in your course pack? I don't know. Wherever it's how to tell a story, which is the transcript for the pirate. Here it is. So it's on page, how to tell a story, page 16. So this is the transcript basically of the audio. And then it talks about the different parts of the chart. And then I talk about the Boy Who Cried Wolf as an example. And yes, this is the story of the Boy Who Cried Wolf, but I actually rewrote it. And you'll notice it uses that rule of 3, where every time the boy who cries wolf, the stakes are higher, the stakes are higher, the stakes are higher, because you want to build that rising action. And then the climax happens at the moment when the date says, could we just enjoy our fucking dinner, please? You know? And if you're comfortable with swearing, you can swear. And again, you don't have to tell the story how it really happened. It isn't like this story happened 4 days ago and I remember exactly what happened with the roast lamb. It's not. It's part fiction. But it's the kind of thing that would happen to me that I'm recreating for the purposes of telling it. So the climax happens right when the date says, could we just eat our fucking dinner before we start talking about next dinner? And then the following action you actually don't even need, because since you've already told the audience the point of the speech, this following action, or what's called the resolution, it's just the central idea. So if you've done everything right, you should actually be able to say the climax, and then the following action can just be implied because you already have a really tight central idea statement, okay? But you can restate it if you want to, right? So this was yet another moment where, and you can kind of reiterate central idea if you want to. I just don't think personally it's necessary. Plus I like when things are a little implicit. I like making the audience have to put the connection together a little bit. As long as I'm being very responsible in my writing, I like to leave out the central idea. I don't like to keep repeating it because I think it's insulting to the audience and it makes them mentally have to work less hard. And I think they like being able to work on those connections. All right. Then you have the option of a third supports. So at this point, we're going to come back to that document, the quick reference guide for supports. And we've already done a story, so we know a lot about those. And we've already done a parallel. So you have a couple other supports that you can do. One support is a universal, like a bumper sticker. So these are like slogans, proverbs, any kind of cultural saying. And you can either use the saying or you can use the saying in conjunction with a rebuttal. And a rebuttal is just responding to a competing point of view. So you can combine them, or you can do them separately. I wouldn't worry about the proofs right now. We get more into the proofs during the argument, but proofs are like kind of these rhetorical figures of argument, like long lists are proofs. And I think long lists are very dangerous to public speakers. So generally I tell you to avoid them early on because you want to use them so much and they're so bad for you. So it's kind of like quitting them cold turkey before we reintroduce them when you could be more responsible. So if you want to learn more about proofs, you can read ahead in the course pack. Proofs are discussed in the next module. But for right now, I would just avoid them personally. Then there are occurrences. So occurrences are real life, actually existing case studies. So like if there was, a case of something that happened on the Geneseo campus, or if there was something in the news, or if there was something like about what President Trump did in a press conference. Those are all occurrences. So those are actually things that happened, and you can use them as analogies. You can just reference them. So these are different types of evidence that you can provide. Then there's testimony. We call these quotes a lot. I hate the word quote. Don't say quote in your speech. I have a quote by. I love this quote by. It's tacky and cliched, and people way overuse it. So there's two types of testimony. There's referent, which are like peer testimony. You know, like if your best friend is always saying something like, "Oh, Lee, I wish you could ever just leave well enough alone." That would be a kind of testimony from a peer about my tendency to overthink things. And then if there's experts, and these are kind of the ones like if you Google quotes about being a visionary on Goodreads. Here's my thing. So let's do that. Let's actually quotes, and we do this all the time. Quotes about, and I think it's fine to do it if you want to. And you find like visionary leader Goodreads. And so let's just pick one. I'll hate all of these, I'm sure, but let's just grab one. I don't know who Germany Kent is. All right, I don't know. This one sounds okay. The great mountain, when seen from a distance, shall always seem closer. But to get to it and to climb to its apex, we may need to take and experience the real walk with resilience and tenacity. So this actually is pretty good. It kind of fits my theme. By Ernest Agyemang Yeboah. Here's the deal. If I'm going to copy this, right, and stick it over in my speech, right? Let's say this is supports number 3 is going to be a testimony. Couple things. One, I'm not going to say, I found this quote by Ernest Agyemang Yeboah. Because as soon as you stand up and say, I found a quote by, and then mispronounce their name, the audience is going to tune straight out because they know you are just phoning the shit in. And I'll tell you, you do something like this, and you're going to comment for me on your outline, and the comment is going to say, either figure out why this person is interesting to you or delete the quote. So if you're going to use Ernest Agyemang Yeboah, you need to find out who this person is. You need to find out how to pronounce their name. You need to do a little background on who they were. So you're going to need to read their Wikipedia, and you're going to need to figure out who they are, and you're going to need to figure out who their author is. And then when you get here to give your actual testimony, you need to say to the audience, when I think about who I am, I always love something, my favorite, what is this person? Philosopher. Ghanaian writer. I don't know if you need to write Ghanaian, but my favorite writer, Ernest. And you know, if you're afraid to pronounce Agyemang Yeboah, you can just write Ernest Yeboah. Again, it's not a research paper. You should always kind of boil things down into the easiest way to say them. My favorite writer says in the book, and then you can put the title of the book, or you can not put the title of the book. I don't care. It's not a research paper, right? Your job is to make the audience believe that what you're about to cite to them is something you have thought about, that you love, that is important, and then you put the testimony there, and then you read it. And you keep it pretty short if you're going to use a testimony, all right? That's how that goes. We don't say the word quote. We don't mispronounce people's names. We don't be like, oh, I found this quote on Goodreads. It sounds kind of good. No, we don't do that. Okay, it's stupid. Don't do that. There's also really creative ways of using testimony. If you love music, for example, and you can think of a song lyric about somebody who, like, what's that Drake lyric? Not conscious, making monsters. Okay, out of women that I sponsor, something like that. Marvin's Room. I love this song. I'm not. Where's the lyrics? I think I'm addicted to. But I don't think. Okay, I don't think I'm conscious of making monsters out of the women that I sponsor till it all goes bad. So what's the point that Drake's making here, right? He's saying that when he has these women, he's just met, he spoils them and gives them all this stuff and thinks about like what they could be. You know, I mean, you know, like it's like I'm taking a stripper to being like a PhD student in college in Atlanta, Georgia, or whatever. But then when things go bad and they're spoiled and they take him for granted and all this stuff, he doesn't realize that he never really got to know them in the first place, right? That he never accepted them for who they are. Notice how much deeper and cooler and more interesting that is than Googling a quote off the internet. So I might say, I really resonate, and I don't, again, keep it casual, write the way you would speak with what Drake says in Marvin's Room. And you can say rapper Drake, right? But again, nobody would say with what the hip hop artist Drake says. You would say, I really resonate with what Drake says in Marvin's Room. Drake is, and you got to think about your audience. Like in this case, the audience is probably going to know who Drake is. But if you don't know, you can write Drake is like a hip hop artist from Canada or wherever he's from. Okay, right? I don't think I'm conscious of making monsters out of the women that I sponsor till it all goes bad. There's your quote. And then now you might want to say, Drake is saying, I feel that because ... Okay, there's your testimony. All right, let's head back over to the last of the supports. And then, of course, you have statistics. So I don't love statistics for a speech to self-introduction. I think they're real stiff. But I don't know. Maybe you have a really great statistic from your personality test. Or maybe you have some kind of something with numbers or studies or percentages that you want to use. That's fine. The big thing with statistics is that you need to translate. So if you're going to give a statistic that's a number, you probably need to do a little work to explain it. Don't over-explain shit. This is a real art, though, with public speaking. You kind of got to know when you're using these different supports what is just the right amount of explanation and what is too much. Now, I've been doing this a long time, so I'm pretty good at striking a balance. But that's why we do drafts. Because if you're over-explaining or under-explaining something, it gives other people a chance to be like, hey, you're over-explaining this. All right. Cool. So that is the body of the speech. So now we have a nice speech. You can go and you can look at the narrative that Jeffrey told and see where it's weak because it's kind of more like an anecdote. You can look at the narrative that Marissa used. And then you can look at the other kinds of supports that different sample speeches use. And the Nell Casey has all kinds of supports. Testimony and quotes from like philosophers and poets and metaphors and lists and enumeration and proofs. I mean, it's all in there. And if we were having a class period together where we had an hour, I would love to go through that step by step with you, but we just don't have the time right now. Now, you still need one more supports. So you're going to have 2 to 3 supports in the body of the speech, but then you also need one more supports in the very beginning. And this is often the one people struggle with. That's why I always tell people to do it last. Because honestly, if you're really, really struggling, you know what's an easy fix for this? Grab the third supports that's not the analogy or the story, cut it out, because you only need 2 in the body of the speech, and stick it here as your warm-up. Right? Hey, Drake, right? Hip-hop artist. I don't love him now, but man, he used to write some really good shit. Marvin's Room, super dope song. Here's what he says in Marvin's Room. What does that mean? Here's why I feel that. Right? That's your warm-up. So you need something concrete. The most important thing about the warm-up is it is not about you. I don't want to see you brought up until the I in this central idea statement. Do not start this introduction with, man, my whole life I've really ... Because when you do stuff like that, the first thing you're telling the audience is like, hey, this speech is all about me. Hope you want to learn all about me. This has nothing to do with you. It's all about me. And the audience is just not down for that. So you want to pick neutral territory. Neutral territory is a supports. You can also use a universal. If we go over to Marissa uses a combination of a universal and a rebuttal, right? They say, that's a good sign of a universal, don't sweat the small stuff. And you've seen this. It's like a book. It's on people's license plate. Rebuttal, but I sweat the small stuff. And now, yes, I agree. Like Marissa gets to the I very quickly, but notice how the first sentence is not I. That's the most important thing, right? Okay. Jeffrey uses a story about a time that Jeffrey went to a really quick story, because you don't want to make a super long story in the beginning about going to the meeting, the conference, and the person being late and how disrespectful that was. All right. So anyway, so just any kind of supports that you want to use there. And then your audience connection statement. You want a we statement, or all of us, or we can all, or you want a kind of a we statement. So for us, it's like we all have been in a position where we're so busy focusing on the future that we're not present in the moment. Right? Or something like that. And then you made a little transition statement, because if you just jump to the central idea, it's going to seem really abrupt. So you might say something like, but not all of us experience that to the same degree. Personally, it's a big part of who I am, right? Because what you've done is you've connected with the audience, but you're also not connecting with the audience, because you have to be unique, but also they have to get something out of it. So everyone to some degree is going to experience this. And so by listening to your speech, they learn a little bit more about this. It makes them feel understood. It makes them see things through your eyes. It lets them reflect on how they behave. But there might be people in the audience who like don't think big picture. They're just like very much into instant gratification. So they really have very little in common with you. But everyone to some degree shares fundamental human characteristics. That's what you really want to do with this we statement. You want to tap into common humanity before you carve out your own unique niche within that. So we've got an intro. We've got an audience connection. And you can be, and as you get better at writing, you can be a little smoother. We're not all exactly like Drake, but we've all been in some kind of situation, so you don't have to necessarily, right? You can kind of start to smooth this out a little bit. That just takes practice and edits and revision. And then we're done, and then we get down to restating the central idea. Obviously, the easiest way to restate the central idea is just to copy this motherfucker and just paste it. But I really like you to maybe sophisticate it up. So maybe instead of doing that, maybe try running through the speech once verbally, and then without looking at your notes, just see what comes up for you. Because I really like the central idea statement to be a little bit more refined, because again, the audience has now been through 2 or 3 minutes with you of a speech. They don't want to just be right where they started. And then for psychological closure, we revisit our opening supports. So you go back up to what you started with, which is this Drake line. And you bring it back down and you revisit the Drake line. You got to decide how to do it. And you can't just do it by restating exactly what you wrote in the beginning. You got to add something to it. Okay? That's the psychological closure. And that means that the audience is instantly going to know that this speech is coming to an end. The key here, though, is if you're going to use Drake up here and you want that psychological closure effect down here, you can't use the Drake again through the whole body of the speech. So you can't have Drake lyrics as one of your supports, because then the psychological closure won't work. You have to have it at the beginning and you have to have it at the end. And then now the last thing that I like to do, when you watch your delivery video, if you haven't already, you're going to learn that about 160 to 170 words per minute is a good pace for a speaker, because that's the pace at which the audience can listen. Most of you are faster than that. So let's say you want to go on the high end of this at 170, and you know that the longest this speech can be is about 3 minutes. That's about the general time length of the speech, all right? So we go ahead and we go to Tools, and we go to Word Count, and we got 452 words, all right? So 452 words divided by 3 minutes is going to give you 150 words a minute, right? 150 and 150 is 450. So that's about 150 words a minute. So you know you're right on target. But I haven't written my analogy yet. So I still got to write the analogy and then maybe redo the math. But I've got a little bit of word. I've got at least 60 words for the analogy. This is just a rough estimate that the speech isn't too long. Like if you did the math and this were an 800-word speech, you already know you got to go back in and take some stuff out of your outline. You got to trim. You're overdoing it somewhere. Maybe you need to delete a supports. Maybe you need to explain a little less. But this is the challenge of a speaker. When you know you're about the right word length, which is about 450 to 480 words a minute, or for the total document, then you're ready to create note cards. When you create note cards, it's a very simple process. So we got our speech template. We're going to submit this. We're going to leave it right in the folder. It's already right where it belongs, right? It already lives right here in our folder. We can see at the top that, actually we can't because we can't see it, but it'll say saved. So we know that it's all set. All our changes are living there. Lee will go through and be like, oh, you got to finish this. Where's your analogy? There's too much detail here, right? I'll give you some comments. You'll go back through, you'll edit it, you'll finish it. Remember, I'm going to write the word done in the title when it's done. So you got to make sure that you see the word done. If you don't see the word done in there, reach out to me, because it may be that your file's in the wrong folder. But make sure you get on top of me if you don't see the word done. All right? Then you're going to take the speech of self-introduction and you're going to revise it. You're going to clean up. You're going to fix all the stuff so you have a really solid outline. And then you're going to create a note card. So you're going to just like find a small piece of paper, something that doesn't make noise. Don't print the script out and read it. Here's what will happen. If you take this whole script up there with you in front of the camera, you will read and you will fail delivery. Mark my words. The more words you put in front of your face, the more likely you are to read. You got to convert this to note cards. So let's just make a little note card. All right, let's just like see what a little note card would look like. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and insert, and I'm just going to insert like a square, like a shape. Let's make a table. All right, so here's our note card, okay? So what do we need to put on there? Well, let's see. Opening, Drake. So, Drake lyrics. If you can memorize them, because it's way cooler. Like, you're going to commit. You can't stand up there and be like, oh, my favorite rapper Drake says in Marvin's room, blah, 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 blah. Like, you got to stand up and you got to go, so. One of my favorite all-time songs is Drake, Marvin's Room. And he talks about a lot in that song. It's very confessional, but one of my favorite lyrics is, I don't think I'm conscious of making monsters out of the women that I sponsor until it all goes bad. And you don't have to rap it. You know, I'm a white lady. I'm not like sitting up here draking it out. But you really got to commit because the audience doesn't want to hear you bland ass read to them. But if you can't memorize it, at the very least, deliver, right? Give it some oomph. And that goes on your note card, okay? So that's little chunk one. Then you need your connection statement. You don't need to write it out verbatim, just don't forget it. Yeah, we're not all like Drake. I mean, obviously, like Drake's flossing money left and right, throwing monies at strippers, getting them into college. But we all have this tendency to sort of want things in the present to be more than they are, and that frustrates the people around us and ourselves. Whatever your we all statement is, you just got to recreate it. So I'm not even going to write it down because you need to practice getting that right. But for me, it's especially problematic. And then for the central idea, I don't even know that you need to write it down because you really ought to learn it. So I might just write, I am a visionary, because I know what the rest of that sentence is. Also, you don't want to read, I mean, think about it, right? If you write this and you take it and you stick it on your note card, okay, and you read it to the audience, you literally have just read the most important sentence of the speech. That would be like me proposing marriage to you, pulling out a note card and then reading my marriage proposal to you off a note card. It smacks as super disingenuous and very disconnected. So ideally, we just cue, where we just write cue words. I am a visionary. That's enough for you to remember the rest of the sentence. And again, it doesn't have to be verbatim what's on the outline. It just needs to be in the ballpark. And then you've got your analogy, right? I am like a, and I don't know, I haven't had time to think of an analogy. And then I might write like, oh, it's making me a new table for some reason. And then I might write a little, I don't know, a little detail and a little detail. Just if there are things that are really crucial to the analogy that you don't want to forget. And then I'm going to write the cooking roast lamb for a new date, right? First there was like, should it have more salt? No, it's fine. Like, just relax. Let's enjoy our thing. And then it was like, oh, maybe next time I'll do half Yukon, half parsnip mashed. And the date's like, listen, you know, it's okay. Like, the date, and then I'm like, oh, next time we should try, or whatever I want to write down. And then that's when the date's like, oh my God, can we just relax and enjoy my fucking dinner? But again, this is a story I wrote. It's typical of my experience. I don't need to read it to the audience. And then for the conclusion, you might want to write a concluding sentence, right? Being a visionary has, and then whatever you want to do at the end, and then back to Drake. That's it. Your note card should not have much more on it than this. And then what you do is you stop using the outline, right? The outline is finished, no more outlines. And instead, you make yourself a note card. You print it out, you write it on an actual physical note card, whatever you want to do, and you start practicing from this note card. And if, as you're practicing, you want to change the way that you explain the Drake lyric, or you want to tweak something here, that's fine. Make yourself a new note card. Go back to the outline and tweak whatever. If it's a major tweak, go back and tweak the outline. But really, at a certain point, you're off the outline because the ideas are all there. They're in a very predictable order. They're the right length. And now you really just got to practice. You cannot over-practice this speech. So the more you practice, the better. Don't talk about wanting to be spontaneous and all that shit. You don't need to be spontaneous. You need to be well-rehearsed. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video. I know it's been long, but again, this video, I mean, I really want you to have a step-by-step tutorial to write an absolutely fabulous speech of self-introduction. And we don't have the luxury of spending weeks and weeks together in class for an online class. And so this is like the only time I'm actually going to be able to get to engage you on this effort. And I'm really excited. I just think that this assignment is so cool. I learned so much about you. It's an opportunity to really wow people. You learn a lot more about yourself, and understanding this format and this layout and how to use analogies and how to use narratives. These are lifelong skills that are going to make you, even if you never give another public speech in your whole life, they're going to make you a sought-after thinker. They're going to make you more creative and more interesting person. So I'm really excited. Do your best on your outlines. Make sure you get them into me by the due date so I can give you some feedback. And then as soon as you can, transition into your note cards and practice, 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 practice.